Session Blood.
Welcome back, everyone, to Session Blood episode 18. And this week we're going to focus on sort of a core concept across a few different card games of life as a resource and how that can apply a little bit to Flesh and Blood. Because I feel it differs from games like Magic the Gathering, for example, and other card games out there. So we're going to sort of dive into that a little bit. And also we're going to go through just a few tips and tricks for each class, things that might be able to help you out in some of your games and at local armory events, all that sort of thing.
Yeah, just a few kind of pointers for each class that could just improve your game just a little bit.
Yeah, but before we get into all that, our favourite thing that we do at the start of every episode, we're going to do some community shout-outs. So,
oh, yeah.
Carl, did you want to kick things off? I know you had a couple.
Yeah, my first shout-out is to a man called Gary Lynch, who has been, kind of like a staunch member of all these armories that whenever I go to, it's always good to see Gary's there.
Big shout out, Gary.
Yeah, big shout out, Gary. And last time, we actually ended up in the final together over this Blitz Armory, which was great to see. Gary lent me his reaping blade, which was, kind of crucial to me making the final. So cheers, Gary, and keep doing what you're doing. Mm-hmm. Did you have any shout-outs?
Yeah, I had a few that I just wanted to run through. My first one was again, I apologise if I get any of these names wrong. It's Lance Silaf from Australia, I think from Victoria Ways. I saw he'd sort of organised a bit of fab in his local scene, at a local store, and they had a bunch of people turn up recently. And I think it's community members like that we need the game to keep sort of growing and expanding. Mm-hmm. So big shout out to you. I really love seeing that.
Yeah, and it's not easy to just, organize something like this. I feel like it requires a lot of time and effort to especially convince players who are quite hesitant, to give it a go. So, yeah, massive shout out, Lance.
Yeah, I think we spoke last time that, Tom, one of our best friends for, 10 plus years easily, he had a tough time convincing me and Carol to play. So, yeah. Expand that out to convincing sort of some locals at stores, and it's even more difficult.
Yeah, so, but the more recruits, the better. So, that's awesome to see. And I just wanted to give a massive shout out to everyone on the Flesh and Blood fan page on Facebook. For me, it's, I'm looking through it daily. It's a great community, and everyone kind of is sharing their updates on Flesh and Blood, whether it's, on the competitive scene or casual play, and we just reached, over 2,000 members now.
Yeah.
And it's blowing up, so it's really good to see that people have this kind of general space where they can kind of exchange information about the game.
Yeah, and I know you love counting your growing numbers of various stats. So I saw you made a post about that. I was like, classic Carol.
Yeah. No, I've been keeping track, actually, whether it's the Discord, Flesh and Blood Discord, for those who are on there. It's good to see that community growing, and also the Reddit, the subreddit for Flesh and Blood is blowing up as well. So I love keeping track of those numbers. So it's crazy to see these groups kind of growing by. I think I saw it up to like 50 members a day for the subreddit.
And I also know there's a lot of sort of the regional fan pages growing. And on that note, I wanted to give a shout out to Corne van Doren from the Netherlands. I know he's been sort of one of the early adopters over there. I've seen him post quite a lot and be quite active over in the scene, which is really cool to see.
Yeah, I think Corne's been kind of supplying the thirsty Flesh and Blood fans with some products. So it was before the Unlimited got released. So good on you for kind of, hooking everyone up.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned Discord before, and I want to give a quick shout out to the Wall Street channel on Fab Discord. So it's a bunch of sort of players, investors, collectors all talking about the game, which I tend to jump on there and read all the messages every so often. It's good fun.
Yeah.
And for my final shout out, I wanted to give one to a player called Richard, who played his first armory at Card Merchant at West City the other day. I think Kale, who we had on the show recently, brought him along. And Richard actually went 4-0 on Ira. Yeah. And yeah, so he beat both myself and Kale on the way there. So
Yeah, and from what I heard, he just learned the game 30 minutes before the tournament started. Is
Yeah,
that
I
true?
think Kale was like teaching him on the car ride over, so that was
That is insanely impressive.
that was good. He took down the world's leading XP player in Kale, took down me playing when I was on Wizard. So yeah, it was good stuff.
Yeah, and jumping into kind of the first topic, we have, looking at life as a resource, which is a concept that, as you mentioned, in a lot of trading card games, our background is mainly in Magic the Gathering, where, with a concept of permanence, you're allowed to kind of take a bunch of damage as long as you're setting up a bigger board presence, which kind of, makes you win the game in the long run, which is something that is completely turned on its head in Flesh and Blood.
Yeah, I agree because I feel for games like Magic a lot of the time the life total isn't that relevant in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
So you might see the life total is like 19-4, but the player on 4 is just like clearly winning the game. They've got
Mm-hmm.
like their Planeswalker, they've got 7 cards in hand, and the game's pretty much over.
Mm-hmm.
And while that can occur to a certain extent in Flesh and Blood, I feel it's a lot different because of the way the things like the turn cycle work.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to check out a good article on that, Hayden Dale actually has published one on Channel Fireball recently.
Mm-hmm.
And I highly recommend checking out that. It gives quite a good idea of how it all goes through.
Yeah.
But yeah, so talking of life as a resource in Flesh and Blood, one of the examples I wanted to bring up is Dash as a hero, because I feel that's one of the few heroes in the game that can actually get down permanents onto the field and have them stay there for the rest of the game.
Yeah. So there is that kind of similarity to, I think it's the one of the main heroes that has access to increasing their board presence.
Yeah, so for a hero like Dash, often you separate to a lot of other heroes, you're able to use your life. Despite what I just said, you can actually use your life as a resource somewhat effectively. And I feel that the reason you can do that is because if you're taking damage to set up your items, so your items take an action point to play.
Mm-hmm.
So things like Induction Chamber and Plasma Purifier, for example. So, red items block for 0, cost 2 resources to get into play. Sometimes you don't mind taking a bit of damage in order to get these items down to build up your board states over the course of the game.
Mm-hmm.
And so Dash, again, like a lot of other heroes, has the classic life as a resource of taking damage to set up big turns. But I feel the items really sort of encapsulate the way that if you're going to use life as a resource, you need to be using it for a very good purpose.
Mm-hmm.
I remember watching the finals of New Zealand Nationals, watching Matt Rogers, the current highest ranked player in the world, playing against John, one of the top warrior players around. And at one point, I believe he took something like 16 or 17 damage. He had a decent life lead and he ended up taking 16 or 17 damage in one turn to go down to about 9 life. And the reason for that is he looked at his board. He had sort of his induction chambers down, his plasma purifiers down, and he thought to himself, if I take the damage here and I can set up a defense reaction in my arsenal, I know I can control the pace of the game for the rest of the game.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought I'd just start off with an example of where using life as a resource is quite beneficial. But that might actually lead into a few examples of sort of traps you can fall into, I feel. One of I suppose a good example of this that I always think of, if we're looking at Welcome to Rathe, because I know Unlimited has just been released for that, is a matchup of something like Ninja versus Warrior, which I used to play like quite a lot back in the day. And so that generally can be a reasonably difficult matchup for Ninja, but leaving that aside for 1 second, if you are using your life as a resource in Ninja, unlike a deck like Dash, which is adding to its board state to set up a sort of potentially controlling position or being able to carry over resources to future turns, when you use life as a resource in a deck like Ninja, it really puts you under a lot of pressure, and I think you really need to be picking a very, very good spot to do that. So if you're playing against a deck like Warrior, and a classic example is they play a card like you've got a really good hand, you've got like your full combo line of Surging Strike, whelming gust wave against each release, and you're thinking like, this is what I want. Like, this is the turn I've been waiting for.
The god draw, like 5-card hand. Maybe.
Yeah, like you've kind of got the nuts, but your opponent plays like a Warrior's Valor and attacks you with their weapon, and immediately it puts you in a bit of a bind. So, assuming the life totals are roughly even, say you take sort of 5 damage from the first weapon swing, and then the problem is there at that point, they are pretty confident that you're not going to block. So first of all, they've got information that if they attack a second time, they feel pretty comfortable, throwing the kitchen sink at you, throwing all their attack reactions and stuff down.
Yeah, and that's one of the things is like, because you didn't block, they still have all those attack reacts available for the second attack as well.
Yeah, and all these resources up. So, they might even drop a Sharpen Steel as well, which they've been saving for a future turn because they're like, I can put the pressure on. So when you take that first hit for 5, that kind of feels like you're committed at that point. So when they attack for a second time, they're probably going to use their Brave Forge braces to get up to 4, so you can't just block with 1 card. And then, you're probably taking minimum 4 damage. They might pump it up to 7. So say roughly, you've taken somewhere in the region of 10 to 12 damage. You've given them a counter on their Dawnblade. And conversely, if you take the first 5 damage and then decide to block with 2 cards on their subsequent attack, then you also risk them pumping up their weapon and still getting a counter, which is a huge blowout. Or you've given up 5 damage and now your hand is pretty terrible. You've got maybe a card in arsenal, 2 cards in hand. You're probably not getting anything back at them. But anyway, so going back to the example, you've taken 10 to 12 damage and you're thinking, okay, now's my time to shine. This is my moment.
I've got the combo.
I've got the goods, this is the business. But the problem is you leave yourself so open to them either just blocking correctly or just blowing you up with a defense reaction. And often an experienced warrior player, they're perfectly aware of this as well. So, you throw out your Surging Strike and they might just say, I'll take the 5 damage. Like, I'm 12 life ahead. I'll take 5 damage and go down to 7. Worse, and then you play your Whelming Gust Wave for 4. They block that for 4 with a defense reaction or using their equipment. And then you play your Mechanologist release. They double block that. Suddenly, you're still 7 life behind. They've still got a counter on their weapon. And you've used your whole hand. And I
guess it's something also that, even if you strip their whole hand, let's say, maybe they have a counter on Tunic to swing back with you with a weapon. Even if you take all of that, and even if they can't attack you with that Dawnblade, that's still a big difference in life total that you have to kind of keep going. Like, you might have regained that tempo, but if your next hand that you draw is a bit clunky, then that whole kind of dream hand did not do what it was supposed to, right?
That's a really good point, and that actually brings up what I was referencing earlier. I mean, even if, say, the life totals aren't that lopsided, so you manage to, like Carol mentioned, you decide that you're happy to give them a counter on Dawnblade because you're pretty confident you can strip their entire hand. So they're not going to be able to attack with the Dawnblade and the counter comes off. Like Carol mentioned, though, by using your life as a resource in Ninja, you have to be very careful because say you get through like your big attack and you like narrow the life gap, that's great. But then you're basically just hoping you draw another good 4-card hand. And maybe you do. And then they block out that 4-card hand. And then like the moment you draw a hand that's like, maybe 3 blue cards, no combo opener. So you have a hand like, 3 blue cards and a snatch or a rapid scrabble and 3 blues. Then that warrior is going to be thinking, okay, I've got plenty of life I've got a big life lead. I'm happy to just pick my spot here. And you have an off turn. That's great. And now I'm just going to get all this damage back. So that's not to say that it's always incorrect to take a bunch of damage to set up a turn in Ninja. Like, I've done this all the time, Sometimes I've been happy to take 10 to 15 damage. Sometimes your hand is just good enough that you're guaranteed going to get through. So you've got the full combo, you've got something like a Razor Reflex and Ancestral Empowerment to get it through. And in that case, that's fine. That's just a classic example of taking damage because you can hit back for more damage. But I think you just need to be aware of what your class's game plan is, and you have to have a strategy for making up that lead. Like, if your strategy is just, try make up some of that lead and see what happens, and then maybe I'll draw 3 or 4 good hands in a row. Like that might work occasionally, but over the course of a long tournament, over the course of your flesh and blood career, it's not.
Yeah, and kind of a similar example from, I play a lot of Brute, and I wanted to give, replace Warrior with Brute in this example, and it's something that I see a lot of Ninja players do against me is, I just play a barraging beatdown and attack with the club, and they have a decision to make. They have a 5-card hand, they can double block the barraging beatdown, save themselves a lot of life, or keep that 5-card hand. And I see a lot of Ninja players just going for that greedy, keep the 5 cards, take 8 damage, and then on their turn, they go for that, massive play, and exactly the same thing happens. They might strip my whole hand and I take 2 damage, but then they draw up the next hand, and if it's not as good, then basically I'm still that 6 damage ahead, and then, maybe I'll use 3 cards and get left with 1. Still, that one swing with the club is enough to put back the pressure and put me in an advantageous position.
Yeah, and I can attest to this, having played a lot of games against Carol, both like friendly games and at tournaments. I've been on the wrong end of those trades a number of times. Like, there's nothing more frustrating than, you take 8 damage from a barraging beatdown. It gives +4 unless you block with 2 cards. They attack. You don't want to give up 2 cards from your hand because it ruins it. So you do it, and then you throw out your entire hand. You get through 5 damage, and then they hit you back for 4. And you're thinking, I had to do so much work to get 5 damage through, and now they're attacking me for 4 with 1 card.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, there are situations where that is correct when you can push through with a razor, when you kind of predict the opponent doesn't have a defense react in arsenal. That's the kind of tricky bit of the game. But I mean, it's something that if you think about in that kind of, as Hayden put in his article, the kind of the cycles, you'll be able to work out and better if the play that you're kind of thinking of, is it going to actually put you ahead or put you behind?
Yeah, and things examples if you have a plunder run in Arsenal as Ninja and you've got an amazing hand, then it's fine because you're thinking this is going to get through. I'm going to draw cards. It's going to be all good. But also kind of don't fall into the trap of just wishful thinking. If they don't block with their equipment here, or if they don't have the defense reaction, then I'm all good. But if they do, I get hugely blown out. Because you can replace, and this thing applies to basically every class. A different example would be Guardian as well. So Guardian, we've talked about in the past, is a class that often involves taking a little bit of damage to set up a big turn. A lot of their attacks are, expensive. They can be in the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 resources to play. And again, if you're taking, you sit there and take 6 to 8 damage on Guardian because I've got a dominated crippling crutch, so that's going to hit you for 11 and discard your hand. I mean, you have to be aware of what class you're playing against, what defensive options they have, how much armor they have left up on their equipment, because it's all well and good throwing out a crippling crutch for 11, but if it gets hit by a red unmovable for 8, then you've got through 3 damage and nothing, and then you're right back under pressure.
I've seen games, for example, when Ninja versus Guardian. To be honest, that was when Welcome to Rathe kind of dropped. Was I played a lot of Guardian, and I tried that situation. Was if I outraised them, I mean, there is a way for Guardian to outpace Ninja, but I remember doing it in the worst way where, they would go Kadachi attack, and I'm sitting on a, 3 blues and a crippling, and I'm thinking to myself, you know what, I'm going to take all the damage because I know that I can dominate crippling crush, and I know they won't be able to defend it. And, I don't block the 3rd attack, they draw a card, they katsu, they put in more pressure, I end up taking 15 damage or something, head them back for crippling, they just take the whole thing, lose 2 cards, and put back pressure on me. So I've definitely been in a situation where it was really cool to get that crippling off, but at the end of the day, it wasn't really worth it.
Yeah, and that sort of goes into knowing the type of class you're playing against, and knowing that if you start taking damage, knowing what they might be able to follow up with, because like, good players playing aggressive decks, if you don't block, they kind of like smell the blood in the water. They're like, okay, they want to set up a big turn, like I'm going to absolutely punish you for as much damage as possible here. And the one of the things about using life as a resource is that in a cycle-based game like Flesh and Blood, um, on most decks you're borrowing flexibility from the future in a way. I feel when like it might be you might be thinking it's fine. I'm on 30 life. I can take 8 damage here and throw out my big attack and like start trying to pull up the tempo. But each time you take damage, you're kind of lowering the amount of flexibility you have in future turns to take damage.
That's an interesting way to look
at it. Because that's kind of how I feel. So like, there's only so many times in a game that you can take 8 damage, and if you're doing that with a mediocre hand, thinking like, oh, maybe they misblock, or maybe I get through a little bit of damage here, that's fine. But it might mean that 2 or 3 turns down the line, you draw the absolute nuts. You've got this broken hand, but it's at the point now you're on like 15 life, and you can't afford to take 8, 9, 10 damage, even with your awesome hand, because that's just going to be too much to make up. So I feel that's kind of a few things to keep in mind. And
and I guess it's I kind of have the same thing with Brute, where sometimes I draw an insane turn. Could be something like a barraging beatdown, an alpha rampage type thing, and you could like wish that they don't have that defense react in Arsenal. But if it's too early in the game, if for example the game has just begun, both players are on like 35 life, let's say, those plays don't, as great as they are, they still just basically, I might get through, I don't know,
6 damage.
6 damage. Let's hope my opponent doesn't have a defense react. A red barraging plus alpha rampage. That's 13 damage. I get 10 damage through, but then they get their whole hand back, and then they put pressure back. I mean, that my point is that play could be so much more impactful at the very end of the game, where your opponent, you're both on 10 or like 15 life, where you put them in that danger zone of, if you take 10 damage, and eventually if you drop down to, let's say, like that 2 life mark, then the reckless swing becomes an issue. So sometimes it's better to wait a bit later on with big plays in the game when your opponent is a bit lower, just so you're basically putting on a lot of pressure. They take a bunch of damage, and they can't afford to do like a big play back, basically.
Yeah, exactly, because you can find yourself against a lot of classes. They have methods of effectively locking you out of the game if you've taken too much damage, thinking I'll start blocking later on, and then they catch you out with a big turn. Say Warrior throws out a bunch of attack reactions, or Ninja, or a Guardian player gets a big pummel through, Brute gets through 3 or 4 Intimidates, and then that just kind of destroys your chance to get back into the game a lot of the time. For example, if you go down to about 5 life against the Warrior player, and they're on sort of 8 to 10, it becomes very, very difficult, because then every single time they attack for 3 with the Dawnblade, you're kind of wondering, like, if I block with 1 card here, they can just throw out 2 attack reacts and win the game.
Yeah.
Or like, now if they draw an Iron Song Determination to give their weapon dominate, if I'm stuck, at this point in the game, you might be low on armor. If I don't have the defense react, I just automatically lose. So my deck might be better. I might have like much higher threat density, but I've left myself exposed to this kind of plan. And I mean, I feel like Warrior and Brute, you mentioned the Reckless Swing, are also good examples of, again, just being aware of using your life as a resource, but being aware of critical life levels that you need to stay above. So Warrior has defense reaction Steel Blade Shunt. So if you attack with a weapon, they can use Steel Blade Shunt, or, I mean, it blocks anything, but if you attack with a weapon and they use Steel Blade Shunt, you take 1 damage. So, if you're dropping down to about 3 or 4 life against a Warrior player, and you're a class that needs to use your weapons, then you can find yourself sort of effectively locked out of the game. I mean, I've had this a lot of times playing Ninja against Warrior, and you're thinking, I just want to chip them out with Kadachis at the end of the game. But, if you go down to 2 life, then you can't do that.
Hmm.
You need to treat your life total as whatever your life total is minus one or two. Um,
Yeah, and I guess most classes have some kind of s- way of getting through, kind of like finishing the game off in a way. Ninja has the Kadachis, Warrior has those attack reaction threats and shunts. There's Reckless Swing for Brute and Dominate for Guardian. So, um, yeah, it's basically it's kind of a lot of the time the game goes down to who has that extra few little bits of life more. That makes a huge difference.
yeah, and I mean, Reckless Swing, that's a card. People aren't aware that it's a defense reaction, so Brute has to discard a card in order to play that. If it has 6 power or more, it deals 2 damage. So it's a card, again, that, playing it in the early game isn't as impactful because 2 damage when you're at 38 life, you're like, okay, whatever, they get on to 36. But if you have those two reckless swings towards the end of the game, um, it's something your opponent, if they're not aware of, it's going to win you the game. And
Mm.
even if they are aware of it, it really makes it very difficult for them to play around.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like, um, I like to, when it comes to looking at life totals, I like to also look at it in terms of percentages. If
Hmm.
you reckless swing on one of the first turns and you get that damage through, you might feel great. I just use the defense react, I stop their attack, they're taking 2 damage. But in the grand scheme of things, if that's the first 2 points of damage, that's, you know, such a small percentage of their life total to compare to when you do it, in some of the later stages in the game when they're on like 3, 4 life.
Yeah, and exactly. And like, again, you'll see sort of a lot of good players when they're playing against Brute when it comes down to the late game. I'm not sure if you watch gameplay videos or when we have tournaments and streaming comes up, you'll quite often see them. They'll block out in a certain way. They might be on 5 life and the Brute player attacks for 7, and the person defending it will make sure to block all 7 damage.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing this because they're aware, like, yes, my life is a resource, but if I go down to 4 life and they've got 2 reckless swings left in their deck,
Mm-hmm.
then eventually they're going to win.
Mm-hmm.
They can just block out all my attacks, wait for those 2 reckless swings, and win the game.
Mm-hmm.
Very similar thing against Warrior with Steelblade Shunt. So, yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated topic. I feel life is a resource. Again, it's one that is very contextual. It depends on what class you're playing, depends on what class your opponent is playing. But it's something that I think is very important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and even if you're playing a game and you have a very tough decision, um, do after the game think about what were the life totals, um, how much damage did I end up dealing by creating. Let's say you decide to go for a big play. Do keep track of how much damage you took to set up that play and how much damage you have dealt back, and in terms of the tempo, was it worth it? Those are the things that kind of uh, they're great to think about during and after the game, but it's kind of, you do have to learn through practice, I feel.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the final things on life as a resource is you can treat your equipment as an extension of your life total a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, apart from classes, Wizard or Runeblade that deal some or fully arcane damage, a lot of the time your equipment, is equivalent to an extra 2 or 3 life. So if you have something like a Scab, Skin Leathers, and Brute, it's going to block for 2 on the first attack and 1 on the second attack.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's effectively adding 3 to your life total.
Mm-hmm.
So that can be a decision that, again, blocking with equipment's a whole other topic, I suppose, but it can come down to things like when you're choosing what equipments to start with when you're playing a game. Am I going to play an Iron Rock Gauntlet or a Goliath Gauntlet in certain classes? That's, the Goliath Gauntlet's great if you play it on something like Command and Conquer, but if you're playing against, say, a Warrior or a Ninja player or a deck with strong on-hit effects, having that extra sort of life buffer in a way is very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely, and that's true. It's like with the Goliath Gauntlet example is basically, are your on-hit effects better than their on-hit effects? Because A lot of the time it's better to have an Iron Rot versus something like a Ninja or Warrior where, they get huge value from their on-hit effects compared to yours. But yeah, that is a...
Yeah, well, we won't go down that rabbit hole. We'll leave blocking with equipment to another day. But the final one I wanted to say is, another example you can see perhaps, particularly in Blitz, but also in Constructed, is playing Wizard. So Wizard's a class that starts with lower life. So it's, in a way, like the perfect class to play something like Arcanite Skullcap.
Mm-hmm.
So Arcanite Skullcap, the way it works is it basically gets +1 armor if you're on lower life than your opponent.
Mm-hmm.
So in a class where you're,
on lower life.
Yeah, so if you're starting on 15 life in Blitz, for example, and knowing that you'll be able to essentially guarantee block for 2 on the first attack and 1 on the extra attack, you're sort of thinking like that seems extremely good.
Mm-hmm.
But you'll often see players in like most matchups, I'd say playing something like Talismanic Lens.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the reason for that is it's similar to the whole Life Gauntlet thing. Like Talismanic Lens, it allows you to opt to.
Mm-hmm.
So I like to, and you'll see most Wizard players play it because it can help set up your big combos, helps open up windows. I like to call it the Velma from Scooby-Doo equipment because, you can't see without your glasses. I crack myself up.
And I guess it really sets up those like powerful wizard turns, doesn't it?
Yeah, it lets you, like, looking at the top 2 cards for free. There's Iberphidia is a fabled card that's critical in Wizard because it's a pitch card, blocks for 0, but it lets you opt to. Having equipment that opts to at any time to set up your Kano effect is actually just more valuable in most matchups instead of that 3 life.
Yeah, it's like instead of, slowly losing, you quickly winning.
Yeah.
Pretty much. So like it just smooths out that the turn where you go big, I guess.
Yeah, so if you're trying to set up a window, and that's, probably not a pure application of the life as a resource example, but in a way, you're trading 3 life over the course of the game to have another card that opens up a window. And the reason you're doing that is because you think Talismanic Lens is going to get you more than 3 damage, effectively. If Talismanic Lens generally was only going to get you 1 or 2 damage, you probably wouldn't play it. But the fact that it can set up these huge combos is great.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes like getting that one key piece of your kind of wizard spell chain can be 10 plus damage, really.
Yeah, because I mean, if you've got a Sonic Boom that you're looking to play at instant speed, and then you Talismanic Lens, and the top card's a blue card, and the card underneath is like a red Vaulted Bolt, then suddenly you've gone from 1 damage to 5 just like that. So. But yeah, I mean, life as a resource, that's probably something we'll touch on again in the future when we look at things like blocking with equipments or, deck reviews, tournament reviews, things like that. But we just wanted to start off by giving players a bit of an insight into some of the concepts of how that works. And like we say, this isn't the be-all, end-all, and don't take any examples we use as just like strict rules, like Karen from Session Blood said, not to take the damage from Warrior.
I'm going to fool Morgenta's lane. I'm going to block.
Yeah, it's not quite like that, but it's sort of some general advice that we think is good to apply to your games when you're, when you're playing.
Yeah, and let's have a look at some little bits and bobs in different classes that
some tips and tricks, some TNT.
Okay, whatever. Tips and tricks it is.
It's going to be explosive. I mean, okay, so so the idea of the tips and tricks section is not really like a deep dive into the classes, and experienced players will probably know of a bunch of these already. But it's something that if you're jumping into the game, there's sometimes a few things that you kind of might not think of immediately, or like, they're things that us as players, if we've played over time, we've been caught out by these things multiple times and have come to learn it over playing a whole bunch of games.
Yeah, and it's something, even if you're versing in class you're not used to versing, it's good to keep in mind what they could potentially be doing. No,
that's true. And I thought the first one, we've spoken a bit about Warrior, so I thought maybe we'd start with Warrior. And so for Warrior, I think one of the cool things Warrior can do is the sidestep. So the sidestep play. I'm not sure if Tom came up with that term, but our friend Tom Penny loves using the term sidestep.
I think I'm going to take credit for that. I think, yeah, that's definitely
It was,
right.
it was definitely okay. It was actually Carol. Sorry,
Yeah,
Tom.
I'm a great warrior player. For those who don't know, I've played like 3 times. No, but it's basically when you have that guaranteed go again, right? So you do kind of like a spoils of war, or a hit and run, or one of or even glint. You know, some of those kind of go again effects that you pump that work on your weapon, and your opponent just kind of you have a bunch of cards in hand, and then your opponent doesn't know how to block your weapon, so they overblock. You go, I don't know, the Spoils of War and Dawnblade attack with 2 cards in hand, and they're like, oh no, I don't have a defense react, so I'm going to block with 3 cards, just to kind of make sure that extra attack reaction doesn't go over, and then you sidestep them and go for like a snatch play or like an enlightened strike or command and conquer.
Yeah, so for warrior, you're basically leveraging your hero ability. So if your weapon hits, it allows you to attack a second time with that weapon.
Mm-hmm.
If you have to have an action point for this, this is why the guaranteed go again is so important for these particular plays. But yeah, so a classic one, like Carol mentioned, is you pitch a blue card, but you've got 3 resources. You play Spoils of War, you attack with your weapon for 5. Now, if your opponent, particularly if they don't have a defense reaction, this puts them in a bit of a bind because they block with 2 cards, and you're just like, I'll give it +3 with Out for Blood, Razor Reflex, things like that. And then it's really annoying for them because then they know that you can use something like, they might have to block with the other 2 cards from their hand, and their whole hand's gone. So they might block with 3 cards, and then you just say, cool, now I've got an extra action point. And a classic example of this is warrior players using this sort of Spoils of War, Dawnblade attack. Opponent blocks with 3 cards, and then they follow up with something like Command and Conquer. And that can be pretty devastating because you've used 3 cards to block the Dawnblade. Command and Conquer's coming in for 6. You've got 1 card in hand that can block for 3 probably. So if you've done this, you're probably taking either 3 or 6 damage, and you're losing your card from Arsenal. And again, it's very hard to play around because you have to be pretty confident that they're just bluffing off the spoils. Because if you block with 2 cards and they do have the attack reaction, you're in a lot of trouble. So
yeah, you're basically taking that damage and activating that Dawnblade second hit anyway.
Yeah, and a similar thing with a card like Hit and Run, which gives guaranteed go again. They might just attack in with the weapon, and your opponent blocks with 2 cards, and then the warrior player's happy. They just say, okay, now I'll follow up with like a snatch or an enlightened strike. And even if it doesn't get damaged through, they've stripped cards from your hand, so your next hand isn't very threatening back. So again,
I actually believe the Taiwan national champion. I think he was playing a list which kind of only had like 6 attack reacts or something like that. Very limited attack reacts because I believe, this is purely, I'm not sure how those games played out, but from the deck list, I'm assuming that, he played it in a way that the opponent tried to play around attack reactions, and he just decided it would go wide. So doing exactly that, like playing a Spoils of War, holding, I don't know, an enlightened strike, and maybe another card and a snatch and arsenal, and your opponent's like, oh, okay, I'll triple block that Dawnblade, and then he goes enlightened strike with go again, and then to snatch, and then your opponent's just in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, and warriors, they can set up with things like Flock the Featherwalkers, which sets up a Quicken token. There's all sorts of ways. I mean, as far as playing around goes, I feel there's no really hard and fast rules. But one thing to keep in mind is keep an eye on your opponent's graveyard. See how many attack reaction they've gone through. If it's quite late in the game and they've gone through a ton of them, you might feel more comfortable just double blocking. Or you can just think if your hand is good enough, you might be happy just if they've got the attack reaction, they've got it.
Yeah, I feel like the best way to play around it is to keep track of, as you said, the graveyard, but also the kind of potential threats that they've pitched. And also, there are a few plays that are kind of, if they attack with a Dawnblade with no Valor, no Hit and Run, and they have 3 cards in hand, there's a high chance that they might just have a glint. So sometimes it's okay to, if it's a naked Dawnblade, just to take it, and hopefully just force them to use that glint without the card draw.
Yeah, or things like a Singing Steel Blade, you might feel that they've got that set up, so it requires you to block to trigger the reprise. And again, sometimes it's going to burn you badly. They attack for 3 and you take it, and then suddenly they give it +6 and you've taken 9 damage. So, I mean, a lot of the time, it comes with experience. So you can maybe try it over the course of the game, see what your opponent's pitched, see what they've played. If you feel like they've gone through a lot of attack reactions, or you just kind of get the sense that they're trying to get a bit tricky with you. Even stuff like they pitch a blue card and attack with Warrior's Valor, and then you decide to block with 2 cards instead of 3. That doesn't have a guaranteed go again, but they might have 1 card in hand, which turns out to be a Sigil of Solace, which they can play at instant speed to gain 3 life. So for those ones, I think our general tip here is more just don't feel like you always have to triple block to get around, because if you do that, you're kind of giving your opponent so much card advantage. Particularly sometimes as well, if they have 1 card in hand and they attack them with something like this, you can kind of just be like, well, I prefer to take damage rather than give you a card in arsenal. And that's a bit of a trade-off.
Yeah, and pay attention to their resources. Sometimes they might have the resources to use an attack reaction, but then they won't have resources to swing at you again with a Dawnblade. Or if they do, they can't use braces on it, so it's actually quite easy to block.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good point. Like, if they pitch a blue card, play a Warrior's Valor or a Spoils of War attack, and they've got 1 resource up, and 1 card in hand, you're thinking, well, okay, go ahead and play a Stroke of Foresight. I'll take a couple of damage, and that's the end of your turn. So, yeah. Again, Warrior's one of the notoriously difficult deck to play against, but I think some things to keep in mind. Now for Ninja, again, very complicated class in a way. Like, there's so many ways to play it. We're just going to be focusing on the aggro version of Ninja because I feel that's more common. There are very good control builds out there, but aggressive is the more common one. One thing really to keep in mind with Ninja is that your Katsu ability only triggers on the first attack that hits each turn. So just bear that in mind when you're looking to sequence your attacks. So, it might be good you really want to open up with that sort of Scar for a Scar or Ravenous Rabble from Arsenal. But if it means that, for example, like your only 0-cost card in your hand is a blue card that you need for pitch value, or if it's something like an Ancestral Empowerment that you really don't want to have to be discarding, if you play the Rabble or Scar and it hits, then you have to make the decision then and there, and that gives your opponent information as to what sort of combo line or sequence you'll be going for. I've definitely been caught out by that myself a few times. Like, I play a Scar, it hits, and I'm like, ooh.
I really wanted that to be blocked out.
There goes my Ancestral Empowerment. So that's, I feel, a really common mistake people can make, or just forgetting and trying to trigger it later on.
Yeah. It's like, cool, hit it with a Scar, hit it with, like, another go again thing, and then you want to activate Mask, and you're like, wait, I can't.
Oh, activate Katsu, it's gone.
Yeah,
so, yeah, again, that's extremely contextual. It's hard to crystallize down to a certain rule, but just be aware of that. Another one I want to talk about for Ninja is basically knowing what type of blocks you're incentivizing for your opponent. So Mask of Momentum, if your third attack each turn in a row hits basically on the chain link, you are able to draw a card. So that's like, I feel sometimes players are tempted just to try get a little bit greedy with that. So for example, if I've got something like a blue card and a red leg tap in hand, but I really want to get the Rising Knee Thrust by my Katsu ability, if I pitch the blue card and go attack with Kadachi, they both hit, and then I play the leg tap, I know my opponent's going to do everything in their power to block that. Like, if I don't have an attack reaction backup, then it's just not going to go through. And the same thing applies to, something like a Scar for a Scar. You might want to, instead of going Kadachi, Scar for a Scar, and then they block the Scar, which means you can't search up a combo piece for something like, a Rising Knee Thrust or one with Gust Wave. Instead of doing that, you might want to open up with your Scar for a Scar. That way they might, block it with 1 card for 3,
Take
one damage, and you're able to use your Katsu ability to search up your other card. Whereas if you're giving them like a double incentive,
to block that.
yeah, to block that attack, then I mean, if you've got the attack reaction, you've got something to back up your third attack, you can afford to be a little bit greedy. But that's definitely something to keep in mind. And on the flip side of that, you can actually use that to your advantage to try force blocks. So if you've got like a counter on your, 3 counters on your Spring Tunic, for example, and you've got your Surging Strike, you've got your Whelming Gust Wave. Basically, you've got all the goods. And sometimes particularly if you're behind on life, your opponent might think like, I'm just going to take the Surging Strike because worst case scenario, I block out the Gust Wave and the Genshis. I'm good to go. So in these situations, you might want to do something like attack with your Kodachis twice, use your final resource plus your Spring Tunic for 2 resources, and play your Surging Strike. And then that puts them in the spot where they basically have to block that. If they don't, then you get to draw a card from Mask of Momentum. If you need a combo piece, you can fetch it up. And again, particularly, if they don't have a defense reaction in Arsenal, or if they've used a lot of their equipment blocks, having to block a Surging Strike with 2 cards really leaves them wide open to getting through either a Whelming Gust Wave or Genshis. That's just one example of trying to incentivize blocking, but I think it's quite a good one. I suppose a few others briefly are just to remember things like Art of War can be used at instant speed.
I really like that one actually. It caught me so many times off guard. When Ninja goes something like Kodachi leg tap, and you're like, okay, they don't have many cards in hand, but they have a counter on Tunics, a card in Arsenal, 1 card in hand, and you're just like, Well, if they Razor, then they might get like 1 card and draw a card from Mask and stuff. But yeah, that instant speed Out of War can be so powerful. It's kind of like another ancestral
empowerment in a way. Yeah. So just because I'm probably a bit guilty when I play Ninja of just using that Art of War, because the ability to banish an attack action, draw 2 cards, and give all your attacks +1. It's very tempting to do it at the start of your turn. And sometimes it is correct to give yourself more flexibility. But if you've already got a pretty good hand, then just bear in mind it can be better to use at instant speed. And I suppose one of the final ones, and also for Art of War, don't be afraid to choose the Go Again the option, rather than the plus damage. If you've got cards like Snatch, or you've got like a Rising Knee that you want to play to fetch up another piece of the combo line.
Yeah, it works really well to go again with the combo pieces. This kind of like the second combo piece type thing.
Yeah, and I suppose the final one I just want to go through is using your Snapdragon scalers correctly. Breaking scales is another one just quickly that you want to save for as long as possible, because once you use your breaking scales, your opponent knows. When you have breaking scales out, it's a constant +1 damage threat on your combo pieces for the entire game. It makes it tough for your opponent. If you crack that very early, or if your opponent baits you into using it, you might get through a bit of damage, but it makes the game much easier for them. And I suppose we should mention the same thing goes for Refraction Bolters and Warriors. But for Snapdragon Scalers as well, just one cool pocket play I sometimes like doing with this, there's a million ways to use it, is by using it with Enlightened Strike. So I really like a play where if you have something like a Plunder Run in Arsenal, if you play the Plunder Run to give you a next attack +3 damage, and then you play your Enlightened Strike with the Draw a Card mode, I feel that can put a lot of pressure on your opponent, because you're throwing out an attack that's dealing 8 damage. You've already drawn a card from your Enlightened Strike.
Yeah.
Your opponent's probably like thinking, like, there's so many ways for this to go wrong. Like, if they might be worried about a Razor Reflex, and then they like completely overblock it, and then you can just use your Snapdragon Scalers to give it go again. If they only block it for 6, you still crack the Scalers, and you draw a card from Plunder Run, and you've already replaced the card from Lightning Strike with one you've drawn. So obviously, you can use it for things like Snatch, and for things like mid combo lines. But I think the Lightning Strike is a particularly good one.
Yeah. And it's, you're attacking for 8. That's a really tough block.
It is, yeah. And like, there's not a lot of things to block for 8. So.
Yeah, and you're just like, You see that in line of strike, and you're just like, oh man, like
What do I do?
yeah, I'm letting them draw, I'm letting them katsu, unless I use basically 3 cards to block, and then if you do block it with 3 cards, then they just pop this, Snapdragon and keep going. So yeah, it's and the next hit that they do still draws them a card. So
Yeah, and finally, just a final note on Snatch. If you're playing it with your Snapdragon scalers, just be careful, I think, sometimes, because particularly if your opponent has a card in their arsenal, because it's really kind of quite damaging to you. If you play out the Snatch, your opponent goes no initial blocks, and then you use the Snapdragon scalers,
yeah,
and they flip over a red sink below or a springboard stop assault, because then
yeah,
you've given up your critical equipment and you haven't gotten the card.
yeah.
So just keep that one in mind as well.
That's my pocket play.
Yeah. Carol's done it to me and I hate it. Moving on to Guardian. I mean, we had Kale, the Guardian Master, on the show the other week.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose we'll just go through a couple of ones.
Yeah, I mean, the use of I've seen a lot of lists kind of make the most out of that kind of instant speed threats, kind of like, Pummel is a great card. Pummel can push through a crush effect on your spell. It can, on your attack, it can make your opponent discard a card. It can turn an attack for 4 with Anathos into 10 damage from Anathos. So I feel like in general, whenever you're playing against Guardian, that Pummel can be very threatening. And what's a lot of great Guardian players use that to their advantage by bluffing the Pummel. So, they're kind of leaving 2 resources open, or maybe, having an energy potion out, so you're constantly threatening that Pummel. And sometimes it can get tricky when you, for example, overblock because you're so scared of that Pummel, and they use a card like Sigil of Solace, gaining them life, or Remembrance to get some of the threats back. So
their own sidestep.
yeah. It's a bit of a Bravo sidestep there.
Yeah, and it's so things like the thing about Pummel, it matches up perfectly. Pummel costs 2 resources, as does the Dominate ability on Guardian.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes if you're a Guardian player, you might decide that you don't actually want to dominate an attack, because the thing is, your Dominate costs resources, so you could have dominated your attack. Your opponent knows you could have dominated the attack, but particularly if you want to be playing around like a big defense reaction, you don't want your attack just to get completely nullified by that. You might just throw out something. Obviously, it takes a ton of resources, but you might throw out something like a Spinal Crush or a Righteous Cleansing, a Crippling Crush.
And that's a good point, because if let's say you're going for a Crippling Crush, and your opponent, and you think the opponent has an unmovable, and you chuck it out undominated, then they're in a tricky position, because if they do unmovable it and you do have the Pummel, then they're still in trouble, So if they block with a card and unmovable, and then you have Pummel, your Crush might not trigger, but they still lose a card. So
That's in particular with a red Pummel. If they block with a card for 3 and unmovable to get up to 11, your red Pummel still goes through.
Yeah,
and then they get crushed, and they just got an extra card from Pummel.
So sometimes you can get in a situation where the opponent just kind of does something, uses way too many cards to stop that attack. Whether it's like double block with the unmovable and arsenal, and then you don't actually you don't do the Pummel that you were bluffing. You just put an arsenal to say for another turn, and their next turn is just completely dead.
Yeah, and once they've kind of assumed you have the Pummel, then it kind of hangs over their head for the rest of the game for so long. So they play around it once, and even if you don't have it, then you kind of you don't, like, you might know that you don't have it, but they don't, and you can just keep bluffing with it over and over. A classic one is Command and Conquer as well. So a Guardian player might pitch a card, play a Command and Conquer. They've got 1 card in their hands and 1 card in Arsenal. And this can be quite effective. So, like, you might even, you might just have another blue card in hand, or maybe you could have even used that card to do something. But by doing this, a lot of the time your opponent's going to think, like, well, they're not just playing a Command and Conquer for no reason. They're not just playing it for 6 and leaving a card in their hand. So they must have the Pummel. And whether you do or you don't, if they block them with 3 or 4 cards, particularly on Guardian, that just gives you another free turn to set up a big turn.
And that's when you just sigil and pass.
Yeah, and I guess finally on Guardian, it's things like sometimes when you want to dominate and when you don't. So even if you're not trying to bluff the pummel, sometimes you might just be happy to strip cards from your opponent's hand.
Mm-hmm.
So you're thinking that like, my card that I'm playing through, maybe the crush effect isn't as impactful as I want.
Mm-hmm.
Something like Righteous Cleansing, a classic example. Like if you're playing against a class where, okay, sure, you look at the top 5 cards and banish 1 or 2 of them, but they'll just think, well, I'm happy to take, I'm happy to take this 10 damage and be fine with it, or I'm happy to take 7 damage here.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you don't dominate it, you can bluff another threat or just save resources with something else.
Yeah, exactly.
And final tip is for Guardian, just be careful about arsenaling a big attack very early in the game, because it can get trapped there for a long time.
Yeah, it's true. And if you're playing against Guardian, it's also tricky because if you do run unmovables and you're super afraid of their big attacks, and you turn 1, you do something, you chuck an unmovable down in your arsenal, your play could be as soon as your opponent, the Guardian, realizes that, they just won't hit their big threat for ages, and they'll probably try and grind you out with the hammer for ages, and then you're stuck kind of with using that arsenal slot to, it just becomes stuck there, and all you can do is do based with 4-card hands instead of 5-card hands.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and on the other side with Guardian, if you play a Showtime early, for example, and search up a Crippling Crush, put it in your arsenal, your opponent knows it's there for the rest of the game. So they're going to be like, well, I can really pressure them knowing they've got that Crippling Crush, knowing they don't want to block. So, but anyway,
and to round off the Welcome to Rathe heroes, I guess Brute is a tricky class to play, and it's but you can do some really cool stuff with it. And one of the things that you kind of want to avoid is, in my opinion, is to go for really kind of big intimidate plays too early on. I feel like if it's really early, as I mentioned before, really early in the game, and you decide to go for a big blowout, barraging into Alpha Rampage play, and they take a bunch of damage, that's great that you've dealt all this damage, but you probably took a lot of damage to set that turn up, and then your opponent has 4 or 5-card hands back to attack you back with. So
yeah, because Brute's kind of unique in the way the Intimidate mechanic works, right? So yeah, I mean, if you get a huge Intimidate turn through, your opponent is getting all those cards back to attack you back with. So it's not like you're stripping the cards from their hand. They're just like, okay, you've dealt damage to me, now I'm going to hit you back.
Yeah, and Brute as a class is the only class in the game actually that doesn't have any on-hit effects. So it does have the Intimidate mechanic, but the reason, why Brute is because of the raw,
raw power.
The raw power. It doesn't need any on-hit effects. It just hits you with a huge club, or it's just a big whack on the head. It doesn't need anything from that hit. But yeah, single intimidates are great. I feel like going for something like the barraging beatdown play, or even just a pack hunt sometimes can be annoying. But if kind of like a tip would be, if you are playing barraging beatdowns, is try not to go for something like a double barraging beatdown. You might think, oh, I'm going to play 2. They both pump my next attack by 4 each, and it's going to be so much damage. And then you strip 2 cards from your opponent's hand, leave them with 2, and then you go for this big club for 12, and they just double block it.
Or even in a way, if you go for if you're relying on them not having a defense reaction arsenal, so you use something like 2 barraging beatdowns into a pack hunt, you intimidate 3 cards, and then they just block with a card in hand, block with a card from arsenal, like a defense reaction, completely nullifies all your bonus damage from barraging, and your turns, you've used 3 good cards and kind of wasted your turn in a way.
Yeah, so that would have been a 4-card hand that you probably would have had to take some damage to
set
to
up.
set up, and then your opponent just gets all those cards back, and they're just like, okay, well, I have a 3-card turn hand now, and didn't take any damage. Another thing is with the self-discard mechanic, I strongly advise you to never be in a position where you're discarding cards to play a card and you're not sure if you're going to hit or not.
Just doing it random, yeah.
Yeah, the key to Brute is, all your cards that block for 3. So it's great if you have a card that doesn't have 6, that doesn't attack for 6 or more. Just block with it the turn before, get out of your hand, so that when you do want to go for a self-discard play, you're hitting the card that you want to discard.
Yeah, and just finally, I was just going to ask you about scabskin leathers, because I know you have a pretty strong thoughts on that on when to roll and when to not.
Yeah, I see it as for me, scabskin leathers is like a spectrum, the more aggressive your opponent's list is, if you're versing something like an aggro ninja or warrior and they have a card in their arsenal, don't use scabskin. If rolling a 1 is gonna lose you the game, don't roll scabskin. Basically, the more aggressive your opponent's list is, the less you should roll scabskin. I feel like it's fine to do it even against, aggro ninja, as long as you have maybe the gambler's gloves
to reroll
or something. But yeah, the more aggressive your opponent is, the less you should roll scabskin. And at the same time, the more control and the slower your opponent's deck is. Let's say you're versing something like OTK Runeblade, where they use all their turns to stack up rune chants, then you can just roll Scabskin every single turn just to put pressure on them. So it's for me, Scabskin's like a spectrum where the more aggressive the opponent is, the less you want to roll. The less aggressive they are, the more you want to roll, and the more you want to kind of go on the aggressive yourself.
Yeah, and like occasionally in certain matchups, it might be a spot where like it's quite late, and if you roll it, it can just win you the game. Or if you have something like a Tome of Findale in Arsenal against maybe a slower deck, and you need to get those 2 action points to get off the tome and draw a bunch. But yeah, all in all, like I played Brute at New Zealand Nationals. I played 12 rounds, and I probably rolled Scabskin less than 10 times over the course of the entire tournament. And most of those would have been against like a Ninja Control and like a Dash deck.
Yeah, exactly. It's like basically if your opponent can't utilize their big hand, then it's okay to play a bit more risky with Scabskin. But if your opponent, if it's hard not to do it sometimes, because you might think, you look at your hand and you're like, oh my goodness, if I get those 2 action points, which is 50%, like I'm going to have a great turn. But chances are you have that 4-card hand because you took some damage beforehand. And if you roll a 1 and your ninja opponent goes again with a full hand, then you're going to have to either do the same thing, just take like 10 to 15 damage again just to get your turn off, or you're going to have to use that great hand to block with. So sometimes that 16.6% chance of rolling a 1
is 100% wrong.
Is 100% lost. Simple maths, quick maths. But yeah, that's just that's the good way I like to think about it, as as long as they can't blow me out with their full hand, then I might lean towards rolling Scabskin a bit more.
All right, what do you reckon? Should we try to go through the Arcane Rising ones, or should we leave that for?
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot.
Yeah, well, we do have some for Arcane Rising heroes. We might come back and revisit those. I think
next week.
Yeah, we've kind of got a little bit too into the podcast, as we always do. So, yes, I feel that pretty much brings us towards the end of the episode.
Yeah, and I hope you got some insight on those kind of Welcome to Rathe heroes, a little bit of basics here and there, and using the life as a resource idea, I think it's something that once you kind of think about it and realize, it really changes the way you look at the game. And I do urge you to check out Hayden's article. He does a lot of good points about I really like his concept of leveling up as well of the game, where he kind of pinpoints exactly what you have to do to get better at the game, which is really, really good.
Yeah, exactly. The whole thing about not just playing the hands you're dealt, but playing for a full game strategy.
Playing the meta game, macro game, seeing the game, from start to finish before it even begins.
Yeah. Okay, Carol.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you for tuning in as always, everyone. And like we say, if you have any questions about any of the concepts we've gone over today, or any thoughts, comments, you want us to clarify things about certain classes, or basically you just want to give someone a shout out or have some questions,
send us an email.
Yeah, feel free to send us an email at sessionblood@gmail.com, or feel free to comment on Spotify, YouTube, and we'll hit you up. And and as always, if you enjoy our content and you're buying stuff from Channel Fireball, feel free to use our affiliate code, SessionBlood, one word. And I believe that's all.
Playing.
Get playing, and we'll catch you next week.